Okay, we got cut off. I got a phone call, so it cut my phone off. So you know who you are calling. You cut me off. All right, here we go. The next part. The baker laughed. Oh, him, he replied, pointing to a door in the back of the shop. He just went out through there. Why? What is he doing there? He's a queer bird, he is, the baker said. He pulled the dough free from his arms and hands, tossed it back into the trough, and began kneading again. He comes through here 3 or 4 times a week, comes to the front door and goes out the back. Why? The boys chorused. The baker shrugged. Jupiter knows, he said indifferently. And that's all you know about him? Mucius pressed. Absolutely, the baker assured him. I don't ask him any questions. What do I care anyway? He pays me 100 sesterces a month for the right to go through. I bet if he counted up his money, he'd have more than all the rolls I ever baked in all my life. Once I made a mistake and asked him, Hey, you in the hood, where in the world do you go to? And do you know what he did? He up and drew a sword from under his cloak, glared at me like the hellhound Cerberus, and said, If you value your life, don't think about it. Since then, I haven't thought to think about it. I do value my life, even though I have to wear myself out for a living. I have a family to support, and 100 sesterces a month isn't chicken feed. The boys stared at the back door. When does he come back? Julius asked. Back? The baker retorted. By Pluto, he never comes back. He comes in at the front, goes out at the rear, but he never returns. Mucius went slowly toward the back door. Where does this lead to? He asked. Nowhere, the baker replied. That's the end of the store. There must be something, Mucius said, pushing the door open slightly. You'd better not stick your head out, the baker called to him. First thing you know, he'll chop it off with that sword of his. But Mucius showed no sign of fear. He opened the door further, leaned forward, and looked out to both sides. The others came up behind him and squeezed into the doorway, trying to see also. Before them, in the gray twilight, lay a bare courtyard. About 10 or 12 yards away rose a high wall. Beyond that was the field of Mars, for over the top of the wall they could see the crowns of cypress trees swaying in the wind. On their right, the wall of the next building projected, so that they could not see where the yard ended. We ought to have a look around that corner at any rate, Mucius said. No harm in that, Julius murmured. Come on, Mucius said. They pulled the togas up to cover their heads and stepped out into the rain. Peering around the projecting wall, they saw that the yard extended as far as a high, massive building that stood at an angle to the other houses. There was no one in sight, and the boys boldly pressed forward. They stayed close to the walls of the buildings, paying no attention to the deep puddles. Where could Tellus have vanished to? The low houses adjoining the bakery had neither doors nor windows in the rear. Tellus could not have entered any of them. But then they came to a tower-like building made of heavy square stones, reaching high up above the 1- and 2-story shops. The boys realized at once that this was Lucos's house. To the left of it was the massive edifice of the Baths of Diana, the only other building around here of the same height. Between the two buildings yawned a narrow, dark gully. From Lucas's house, a rectangular spot of light fell across this space and upon the wall of the Baths of Diana. There's a door open in Lucas's house, Julius said softly. Wait, Antonius whispered, and he crawled forward on his hands and knees as far as the edge of the splash of light. Then he flattened out on his belly and squinted over the threshold. He withdrew his head hastily and crawled backwards to them. Tellus is in there, he reported. What is he doing? Mucius asked. Nothing. Where is Lucos? Flavius asked anxiously. I didn't see him, Antonius replied. What was the next step? If the boys crossed in front of the door, Tellus would certainly see them. They stared indecisively into the dark gully, not daring to go forward and unwilling to go back. Then they noticed several thin rays of light in the wall, about halfway between their observation post and the door. Mucius crept over to this light. Then he beckoned the others to follow him. But he held a warning finger to his mouth. The light came from a window over which heavy boards had been nailed. There were cracks between the boards, and the boys pressed their faces against the wet wood and peered through. The window was also protected with iron bars, but they could see directly into the big vaulted room in which they had been received by Lucas. It was darker than it had been when they last saw it, for there was no fire in the fireplace, and the horrible masks on the pillars were not lit up either. A dim lantern was burning on the table at which Lucas had sat. The ceiling and the distant corners of the room were shrouded in dense shadows. On the table, the boys spotted the basket of snakes, but it was covered over with a cloth. Next to it lay a short sword with a wide blade. Tellus was sitting on a hassock and wiping the rain from his face. His cloak lay on the floor beside him. He seemed to be waiting for something, for now and then he tilted his head to one side and listened attentively. "He's waiting for Lucas," Flavius breathed. But suddenly Tellus jumped up, crossed the vaulted room rapidly, and vanished behind a curtain which hung across a niche in one wall. "There's another room," Caius said. "Lucas is probably in there," Mucius declared. "Or the Red Wolf," Antonius said. "If only we could hear what they are saying," Mucius said impatiently. But Tellus and Lucas remained behind the curtain. The boys could hear someone talking, but could not make out the words. "I'll sneak over to the door and listen," Mucius said. "I'm coming too," Caius volunteered. "So am I," Antonius said. "Xanthippus told us to keep together," Flavius complained. "All right then," Mucius said. "We'll all go. Take off your sandals. If we make the slightest noise, we're done for. Stick close behind me. If I call, 'Watch out!' we all make a dash for it. Through the bakery, remember?" They slipped their sandals off, made a small heap of them next to the wall, and stole up to the door. For a while they stared into the vaulted room. It remained empty, and Mucius led the way across the threshold. He walked on tiptoe, placing one foot ahead of the other very slowly, balancing himself with his arms. Every so often he paused and stood motionless, listening. The others followed his example. At last they reached the curtain and remained standing in front of it, holding their breath. From behind it they could hear a mysterious, tinkling, metallic sound, and a hoarse voice murmuring 100, 200, 300. Mucius moved the curtain aside ever so slightly and found himself looking into a cellar-like chamber. The windowless stone walls glistened with dampness. On a small table stood a flickering candle that had almost burned down. Tellus was nowhere in sight, but Lucas sat with his back to the curtain. Mucius recognized him at once by his long, dirty yellow hair and the black cloak with the silver stars sewn on it. The soothsayer was busy counting heaps of gold pieces which were stacked up on the table. As he finished with each stack, he pushed it into a bag. He was completely absorbed in what he was doing and went on murmuring, 400, 500, 600. But suddenly he stopped and whirled around toward the curtain. His face was not painted black and white at this time. Instead, he wore a clay mask tied over his face, the kind worn by actors on the stage. For a while he stared fixedly at the curtain. Then he jumped to his feet. Frightened, Mucius let go of the curtain. "Watch out! Let's run!" he whispered sharply. Flavius was the first to move. He shot toward the door as if he had been catapulted, but he tripped over a tight string stretched across the floor and fell forward on his face. Immediately, the back door banged shut. The boys threw themselves against it in despair, tugging and pulling, but in vain. "Don't bother," a hoarse voice said. "You won't get it open." Lucas had drawn the curtain aside and confronted the boys. They could see his eyes glittering evilly behind the clay mask. With clumsy footsteps he slowly approached them, and the boys instinctively moved closer together. Flavius was still stretched out on the floor, not moving. Either he was paralyzed by fright or playing dead. Lucas went up to the fallen Flavius, stooped with a groan, and pulled the boy by the hair. "Help!" Flavius screamed piercingly. He sprang to his feet like a flash and fled toward his friends. Lucas gave a short laugh. Then he sat down on the hassock, folded his arms, and said menacingly, "I knew you were coming. You fell into the trap. This time, you won't escape me." "If you do anything to us, I'll tell my father," Caius said. "You will never have the opportunity to tell your father anything again," Lucas replied. A chilled silence followed. Finally, Mucius cleared his throat and said somewhat hoarsely, "We don't want any trouble with you. We saw Tellus going in here." "Tellus is not here," Lucas said sharply. "Isn't he in there?" Mucius ventured, pointing to the curtain. Tellus has gone home, Lucas said. A door in there leads to the side street. But his cloak is lying there, Julia said. For a moment, Lucas stared at the cloak lying beside the hassock. Then he croaked. He was in a hurry to get home. Let us go home too, Flavius cried in a shaky voice. Oh no, Lucas said. You have no right to keep us here, Julia said defiantly. You have no right to come spying around here, Lucas replied mockingly. People who pry into dangerous places must expect unpleasantness. We are not afraid. We are Romans, Mucius said heroically. Bravo, my son, Lucas chuckled. You have no need to be afraid. I'm not going to hurt you. That sounded a good deal pleasanter, and the boys breathed easier. Perhaps Lucas was not as bad as he pretended to be. You mustn't put a spell on us either, Antonio said. I know a lot better wizard than you. He'd take the spell off right away. I do not bother with enchantments, Lucas said tartly. I can only see things that are hidden from other people. That is how I know why you are here. You are looking for the desecrator of the temple. You think he is Tellus. The boys were taken back. Lucas not only had second sight, he could even read thoughts. Mucius nodded in assent. We don't know for sure that it is Tellus, he said. But we suspect him. Perhaps it was the Red Wolf. Do you happen to know who the Red Wolf is? Lucas sat as though stunned for a moment. Then he suddenly jumped to his feet, waved his arms wildly, and screeched in a fury, There is no Red Wolf! Tellus is innocent! I am the desecrator of the temple! I alone! Ooh, it's getting curiouser and curiouser.